Here now to tell you about it is Walt Disney.
Welcome. I guess you all know this little fella here. It's an old partnership. Mickey and I started out the first time many, many years ago. We've had a lot of our dreams come true. Now we want you to share with us our latest and greatest dream.
One of the great joys of being a parent is getting to share stories with your kid. Storytelling is a uniquely human, transcendent activity, a bonding ritual as old as humanity itself. So when you start to create that bond with your children, you think, which stories do I want to share with them? You think about childhood favorites, which you haven't thought about in years. For me, that included Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad, James Marshall's George and Martha, and Richard Scarry's Busy Town Stories, among others. But I also started thinking about fairy tales in a way I hadn't before. Traditionally, there's been a canon of fairy tales which most people know, if only by common reference. Jack and the Beanstalk, Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, etc. But I think like most people, I couldn't even specifically remember the first time I heard any of them. It seemed like they were just always known to me from an early age. Thinking more deliberately about my kids' cultural education, I wanted to make sure that all those classics would be part of my kids' childhoods because fairy tales are important. There's a reason they've been around for hundreds of years. The simple, fantastical dramas they tell are foundational myths and legends for a child's understanding of the world. They're often funny, but they're just as often scary, and essentially they teach children important truths on a level they can understand, about how the world is a dangerous place, but if you are brave and clever, you can survive the various wolves and witches who want to eat you. These stories do come from a harsher time in human history when, for many more kids than today, death was lurking around the corner. But that foundation of seriousness is why these stories have lasted and can still enchant modern children, because they were meant to both enchant and educate them, so that they, too, would be built to last. And incidentally, I think the reason most fairy tales feature young girl protagonists is because, historically, girls have needed to be more cautious in order to survive. When I was making my mental list of fairy tales that could be on regular rotation for story time with my daughter, the story of Rapunzel crossed my mind, which was one of those stories that I never had the book of as a kid, but I knew it well enough through common reference. Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair, that's what I knew about it. So after a little browsing, I found a really nicely illustrated and respectfully written version, and I knew I didn't want anything that was modernized or trying to be hip or funny. I wanted the real thing, the original classic. I read it to her, and she really liked it. It became one of her favorites, so much so that we can recite it by heart together or act it out together as a game. And what I discovered in the full original version of Rapunzel is that, unsurprisingly, there's some layers of serious meaning and some darkness to the human drama being told in this story for children that most adults don't know about. Right from the start, the opening line in our copy of the story reads, "Long ago there lived a man and a woman who had no children. As year followed year, this was their only sorrow." Heavy stuff already, right? When they do finally have a child, she's taken away from them by a witch, or sorceress if you prefer. When this girl reaches adolescence and is starting to become a woman, this new stepmother hides her away from the world in a magical tower. Her long hair, a product of her body's maturity, is her one link to the outside world. But of course, this arrangement doesn't last because once a handsome prince finds her and starts to visit her, she becomes pregnant. And being so sheltered, she doesn't even realize what's happened to her. But her stepmother does, and in a fit of rage, she rejects her adopted daughter, shouting, "Oh, you wicked child! I thought I had kept you safe, away from the whole world, but you have betrayed me." That's not the end of the story, but you can see already how, even though this is a fantasy tale for children, that doesn't make its subject matter any less relevant to real life. Rapunzel, and most classic fairy tales that we know in America, were the creations of Europe. In American culture, we put a lot of emphasis, or at least we pay a lot of lip service, to the concepts of creativity and imagination. We tell kids, use your imagination, be creative. Did you know that Albert Einstein said that imagination is more important than intelligence? We say imagination is magical, and it is, but we don't think much about where these intangible concepts actually come from. One of the most basic ways we can measure imagination or creativity is through our ability to come up with stories. So, are the kids who watch the most TV or movies the most imaginative? I don't think so. But human beings hunger for stories, and your kids will too, so exercising judgment over the stories they're getting is an important responsibility. And assuming you are not one of those parents who doesn't care what their kid is being exposed to as long as it shuts them up, you do want the stories they're being given to have some imagination and creativity to them because those are important qualities. The ideal arts and entertainment for children have good morals and messages, but are also imaginative and creative, and crafted with a high level of technical skill. But stuff that meets all of that criteria is harder to come by. It's overwhelming how many choices there are, and one of the reasons there's so much kids' content is because most of it is made with pretty low standards. And it's not like you've got the time to screen everything yourself first. Most parents just want to be able to get the kids' books and movies and whatever else from a source they can trust. And what's America's first name in good, wholesome fun for kids? What's the brand that every American associates with quality, family-friendly fare? Who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me? In the average American's mind for almost 100 years now, Disney is a name that is synonymous with imagination and the magic of imagination. You've probably been hearing that your whole life. I know I have, and I know my boomer parents did too. They were the first generation raised on TV, and Disney was a big part of early television, thanks to the weekly Wonderful World of Disney series, hosted by Walt himself, from 1954 to 1966. In addition to this weekly primetime show, you also had kids coming home to watch Mickey Mouse Club after school, every weekday from 1955 to 1959. The show began with a march and a uniform, which kids were encouraged to wear as they watched. Besides a lot of original programming, they would frequently show their own films from their already vast back catalog. The boomers were really the first generation to have Disney be regularly imprinted on their childhood memories on a weekly basis in their own homes. And every generation since them has raised their kids on Disney to some degree because that's how they were raised. The trust we give Disney when it comes to babysitting our kids is so automatic, we don't even think about it. In Walt's own time, as a man, he became regarded as the foremost authority of children's culture and entertainment. And long after he died, his surname has been a brand synonymous with childhood itself, as surely as the brand name Kleenex is used synonymously for tissue paper. As Disney is the first name in kids' entertainment, the average parent tends to unconsciously categorize all media made for kids as either Disney or non-Disney, with the former being the quality brand, the big name brand. Disney makes the best kids' entertainment. Everybody knows that. Disneyland is the happiest place on Earth. Look at how happy Mickey Mouse is all the time. What? You don't like Mickey Mouse? What are you, a commie? He exists only to make you happy. Do you hate happiness? Now, if you asked a bunch of parents why they implicitly trust Disney to entertain their kids, you wouldn't necessarily hear too many of them say that it's because Disney is the most imaginative entertainment. More likely, it's because the average parent feels reasonably sure that what Disney makes is appropriate for their kids. They don't want their kids exposed to inappropriate sex and violence or stuff that will give them nightmares, and who can blame them? Now, Disney's been around since the 1920s, so of course they've had to change with the times somewhat, meaning that you don't see so much of the scarier or more upsetting things from the company's older films anymore. In whatever their current stuff is, you also won't see things that are now considered socially inappropriate or culturally insensitive, because they're always trying to accommodate and keep up with those moms who say, "Can you believe what they used to show us when we were kids?" The company always wants that castle and Walt's signature to be seen as a parental seal of approval, as they have been for decades. I mean, you try telling your kids' grandparents that you don't want them to buy their grandkids too much Disney stuff. You'll see a wounded sense of intergenerational corporate trust staring right back at you. How did Disney, this man, Walter Elias Disney, accomplish this incredible status of having his name be synonymous with family entertainment? Well, at the very beginning, Disney only made animated cartoons, and they were very popular, in large part because they played so well not just to little kids, but to their moms who were taking them out to the movies. I think this was because both visually and in terms of story, Disney cartoons emphasized cuteness. Lots of cute little animals, lots of cute little babies getting into silly little adventures. And they were inoffensive. Disney hardly ever got complaints about racy content the way that some of the other cartoon studios did. Disney quickly established a reputation for making cartoons that were good for the little ones, and therefore fun for the whole family. Bear in mind, too, that this was at the point in Hollywood's early days when the industry was getting a lot of backlash from the public about how this powerful new form of mass media just had too much sex and violence in it. This led to the creation of a self-censorship code, the Hays Code, in 1933, and it applied to cartoons as well, but like I say, Disney was relatively unaffected. Then, in 1937, a milestone. Disney makes the first feature-length, hand-drawn, animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. At the time, this was a very risky business proposition, but Walt knew his audience, and he knew that a classic fairy tale adaptation was a solid choice for a story. Development on the film began not long after they'd had a huge success with their adaptation of a classic fable, The Three Little Pigs, in 1933, which won an Academy Award. Snow White was a phenomenon, and thus a template was set. Until Walt's death in 1966, 19 of the 24 animated films which he produced would be adaptations based on pre-existing fairy tales, fables, folk tales, mythology, and children's literature. A similar pattern was followed when Disney got into live action as well, beginning with their first feature-length live-action production in 1950, Treasure Island. When they got into television around the same time, their most popular shows were based on pre-existing characters too. The frontier folk hero Davy Crockett and the pulp swashbuckler Zorro. From 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to Old Yeller to Swiss Family Robinson and Mary Poppins, their most popular live-action films were pretty consistently adaptations to which, like their animated films, they would add that magical Disney touch. It's fair to say from the beginning that Disney was largely in the adaptation business. Some of them were contemporary, like Old Yeller or Mary Poppins, but the oldest material tended to be used for their animated films. Some of those classics, like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, could be centuries old. They certainly weren't under any copyright. Even some of the relatively more recent stories they adapted, like Alice in Wonderland or The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, were already in the public domain by the time Disney chose to animate them. I'm not suggesting that Walt was more drawn to source material that was free, but it was more convenient than having to argue with the author of Mary Poppins about protecting the artistic integrity of her work, for example. It's not like they had to ask Rudyard Kipling for permission to add a swing music soundtrack to the Jungle Book. Now, Walt Disney himself did genuinely like all of these various stories that he put so much time and effort into producing his own versions of. But it's been suggested by more than one Disney biographer that his continual sourcing of classic material for animation was partly due to his insecurity about being taken seriously as an artist. The zenith of his efforts to be taken seriously as an artist actually came pretty early in his filmmaking career with Fantasia. This was a whole animated version of a classical musical concert that was only the studio's third film. This desire to be taken seriously is also why he branched out beyond animation, but that's another subject. And by the way, the ambition to create something like Fantasia is really admirable, and it does help kids get exposed to classical music, but that's a much more direct form of cultural osmosis than his fairy tale and literature adaptations. By focusing so heavily on adaptations of classics, Walt Disney was essentially, inadvertently, creating a parallel canon of children's culture, drawn from all these various sources that could go back literally hundreds of years in origin. And of course, since this strategy had brought so much success while he was still alive, the Walt Disney Company continued the practice of sourcing existing culture for adaptation, all the way to the present day. A century of Disney, as they just recently celebrated. But how much of it is really theirs when at least half of the stories and characters you're looking at here did not originate with them? The company takes the credit, basically, by conflating their versions with the originals in the public mind, or outright replacing the originals. And this was already going on for the majority of the studio's history, even before they started buying up other culture creation companies like Marvel or Lucasfilm or Jim Henson Studios. The irony of Walt's legacy is he adapted so many favorite stories from his own childhood only for his versions of those stories to functionally become the primary versions in most Americans' childhoods after him. As big as his ego was, he wasn't setting out to replace the originals. To him, it was homage. This makes more sense when you consider that in Walt's lifetime, movies were still considered kind of an ethereal art form, like a performance. People did not own copies of films that they could play in their homes over and over again. Even the idea of watching a film at home on your TV was a recent novelty at the end of his life. And even then, you still had to tune in on a certain date and time just to be able to watch it once. So, for Walt, making an animated film of something like Alice in Wonderland was functionally more like putting on a performance of the story, which people could leave their homes to go pay money for and see in a theater, and that would probably be it for the rest of their lives. When they went home afterwards, the book, the real actual work, would be there in a rarefied place of honor on the bookshelf for children to enjoy as the real thing, the real original story. It's important to acknowledge with respect to Walt Disney himself that he did not have any mercenary intentions towards having his versions of the classics replace the originals in the popular imagination. In fact, while doing research for this video, I found the following quote attributed to Walt himself. "It has always been my hope that our fairy tale films will result in a desire of viewers to read again the fine old original tales and enchanting myths on the home bookshelf or school library. Our motion picture productions are designed to augment them, not supplant them." In the early days of Disney, he was just drawing from a cultural canon that was already well established. Walt was born in 1901. He was the product of an era when the dominant form of popular media was still the printed word. In newspapers and magazines, in popular novels and literature, and in children's books. Walt wasn't a particularly sophisticated or intellectual man, but he was raised in a literate society, one where it was taken for granted that everyone ought to be educated according to the common standard of a shared cultural heritage, ranging from the Brothers Grimm to Shakespeare. In Walt's day, it was assumed that most families would have a King James Bible in their homes, and they would read it together. Needless to say, by the time Walt died in 1966, America's sense of shared culture had been drastically transformed by mass media. We were already well on our way to becoming a post-literate society. It wasn't completely gone yet. I don't think even in 1954 there were too many adults who would have felt that taking their kid to see Disney's Alice in Wonderland was an adequate substitute for having their kid read the book. And by the same token, when the Disney versions of stuff like Peter Pan or Pinocchio or the Brer Rabbit stories came out, Disney was making them for an audience which they assumed already knew these stories. Before there was what you might call the global culture of corporate mass media, it was still assumed that beginning in childhood, people would receive some baseline cultural education that would include stuff like Peter and the Wolf, so that if and when they saw the Disney version, they could appreciate it as just the Disney version. Obviously, movies have been made from books since the beginning of the movies, but the younger you are, the more that the movie version of a story imprints itself on you as the definitive version, if it's the first version you've seen. In a literate society, kids and adults alike are more likely to have read, or have had read to them if they're kids, any given story before they see a movie of it. But today, we really are virtually post-literate. When we teach kids to read today, we certainly don't expect the average student to be educated according to a canon of classics. A lot of the older Disney films had the custom of opening with a live-action book being opened, inviting us into the story. Old Hollywood literary adaptations actually did this a lot, and Disney didn't have to do it, but they did it out of respect. They're acknowledging, this is our tribute to a classic. Parents, kids, if you want the original, it's right up there on that proverbial bookshelf. Kids being kids, they always have a lot less knowledge or awareness of how many movies are based on books or other source material. They just take them at face value. So at least for a while, Disney was letting kids know where their stories came from. The knee-jerk defense of Disney, whenever anyone criticizes the ubiquity of their versions of classic stories in kids' lives, as opposed to the originals, is still, well, the originals haven't gone anywhere, you and your kids can still just read them. And yeah, I'm sure back in the day there were a lot of kids who saw something like Disney's Treasure Island on the Wonderful World of Disney, had their imaginations piqued, and then checked out the book from their local library, like Walt wanted. But how many kids do that now? It's a little different when you can just watch the movie over and over at will on Disney+. These aren't specifically Disney problems, these are post-literate society problems. There's fewer adults reading books too, but when it comes to kids reading fewer books and spending more time in front of screens, Disney just happens to be one of the biggest beneficiaries of that. Now, of course, there's many great and entertaining films based on books, but as anyone who takes the time to read can tell you, even a great movie isn't a substitute for what you get out of the book it's based on. What I don't think people realize is that this is just as true for the simplest of kids' stories. Everyone is reading less overall, but kids kind of suffer the most from that because their minds are still developing. It's actually more important for kids to experience those stories through reading and actual parent-to-child storytelling because that's when your imagination is at its most potent, literally in a transformative psychedelic sense. Movies are a psychedelic immersive experience too, but it's a passive experience. The days and weeks you might spend actively absorbed in a story like The Wind in the Willows, as opposed to watching the half-hour Disney version, That's a rich personal journey into a masterpiece of children's literature. When you watch the movie, all the creative work has already been done for you, with a story that's been simplified and abbreviated so that the very littlest of kids who might be watching can understand it. Like a piece of brightly colored candy, it doesn't require any effort to consume. And when this is a kid's first introduction to a classic, they tend to feel like the original work is too difficult by comparison and not worth the effort. And we're not even talking about complex literature here, we're talking about kids' books. But even a good storybook of something as short and simple as Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks and the Three Bears with a handful of illustrations, this engages your kid's imagination more than having every aspect visualized, put into motion, and voiced by actors for them. To the parent who says, well, they're still the same basic stories, at least my kid is getting some version of them, I don't know what to tell you. Disney's high position in our culture is considered so unimpeachable that, unconsciously, their version of any story is always commonly assumed to be the best possible version of that story. That is because both Walt and the Walt Disney Company, after he passed on, successfully sold and continue to sell the Disney name as the pinnacle of children's entertainment. And after so many years of the company following Walt's example of adapting classic material from the past, our collective cultural inheritance has largely become an inheritance of Disney versions, if only because they're easier to watch than to read. And if you are a parent who wants to get a storybook of Winnie the Pooh or Beauty and the Beast, well, what do you think are going to be the most commonly available versions? At any used bookstore, there's about 10 times as many Disney books for every non-Disney book when it comes to stories that they own a version of. Often it's decades worth of tie-in books that have been in circulation. And if you're shopping online, the Disney versions are certainly going to be prominently displayed right next to the originals. The company got into this game early on with their entries in the Little Golden Books series, which, back in the old days, at least had high standards for illustrations. But then, as now, these Disney books are just truncated versions of the movies, which were truncated versions of the original stories to begin with. Functionally, they're not so much books as advertisements for the movies, and for the Disney brand in general. There's a snowball effect to all of this over the past century because from Snow White onwards, once Disney produces their own version of a classic story, or a classic character like Snow White, they never really go away. They're kept around in the public consciousness as part of the company brand through merchandise and promotion and, of course, re-releases. Disney had at least as much of a genius for marketing as he did for film and animation producing. Whenever he made a new film, for example, it was immediately advertised as a quote-unquote masterpiece, or a classic, something the company still does to this day.
For over 50 years, Walt Disney has turned classic stories into classic animated motion pictures. Now the tradition continues as one of the world's greatest stories becomes the newest Disney motion picture classic.
It's a cheap trick, but it works. This parallel canon of children's classics, which Disney created over a long period of time, and which eventually came to replace the originals in a post-literate society, based on Walt's quote about the importance of reading, I really don't think he would have approved of this cultural takeover which his company came to represent. But I do think the modern shareholders of the Walt Disney Company are perfectly fine, to the extent they even think about it, with the idea of millions of children preferring the Disney versions of classic characters and stories to the originals. The size, scope, and influence of the company has essentially made them the arbiters of all this cultural heritage. So much of it was up for grabs being in the public domain, and they grabbed it. This is the real secret behind Disney's longevity. This is what turned Disney, the company, from merely a film studio into a trillion-dollar corporation. The fact that their target audience is literally every child on Earth. The company's mission is to initiate every child into the Disney conception of childhood. It's not merely Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck cartoons that made them such a permanent fixture. Those characters sell a lot of merchandise, but they're not what creates emotional attachment to Disney for the rest of people's lives. What did that was how, decade after decade, it was their versions of the classics that became the most ubiquitous in America. That early model, which Walt established, of focusing on adaptations of classics, was the best investment he ever could have made for his company in the long term. And that's because, effectively, these were less adaptations than acquisitions. Take The Little Mermaid, for example. Whatever you think of the Disney film, and I admit it has its charm, suffice to say, it's completely replaced the original Hans Christian Andersen story in people's collective consciousness. Again, in a post-literate culture, how many kids are being read Hans Christian Andersen stories? You could say the same thing about The Snow Queen being replaced by Frozen. When Disney goes back to those older sources, I think they know, as Walt did, that as long as they don't modernize it too much, it's always a smart investment to continue building up their library with stuff that's already withstood the test of time. The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, for example, was made in 1977 and based on the children's book from 1926. The film pretty much plays the same to a kid watching it today as it would have 50 years ago. And in the 50 years since that movie, Winnie the Pooh has become another one of those characters who's functionally a Disney character now because he's been franchised and merchandised so much beyond that initial adaptation. Another example of that would be a title like 101 Dalmatians, because while Winnie the Pooh already had some history behind it, the book that Dalmatians was based on had only come out a few years before the film, so it was overshadowed almost immediately. A few sequels, TV series, remakes, and spin-offs later, and the status of the original has been totally subsumed. The pre-Disney roots are severed, and the post-Disney franchise version becomes self-contained. Recently, this process has entered a whole new phase where Disney remakes its own animated adaptations in live action, separating it even further from the source material. The power of those original stories, the magic of them, that becomes Disney's magic in so many children's minds. Maybe this is partly due to how Disney uses the word magic as often as possible in their marketing, like they own the idea. And because this steady, continual cultural accumulation has built up such a vast library for Disney, even the stuff that doesn't catch on right away still gets kept around for decades until they see a return on it. Like Sleeping Beauty, for example, was actually considered a financial disappointment upon its release, but they've kept it in circulation long enough that all this time later, they're still merchandising and franchising the characters. Just in the past decade, there were 2 spin-off films based on Maleficent. They never let an IP, or intellectual property, go to waste. And their empire is based on turning all of human artistic achievement into Disney IPs.
You know, one of the hardest things about this business is that it is a business. Doesn't matter what we're selling, whether it's cars, nuclear weapons, or yes, even toys. The bottom line is the bottom line. And what are children, after all, but consumer trainees?
Phil Simms, you just won the Super Bowl. What are you doing next?
I'm gonna go to Disney World.
If our cultural memory in a post-literate society only goes back as far as the birth of moving pictures and mass communications, then who owns more of our media-saturated childhoods than this one mass media conglomerate? That's bad enough in itself, but let's also consider, just in terms of aesthetics and taste, what it means for Disney in particular to be the company which has that much power over children's culture and children. I've been referring a lot to the quote-unquote Disney version of various titles, but what are the chief characteristics of that? What is the Disney style? Well, as I mentioned, Walt wanted his cartoons to have a distinct cuteness factor from the very beginning. Excepting those occasions in the early films when a villain or an animated sequence was really meant to be frightening to kids, the default Disney designs for everyone and everything else, from kids to adults to animals to fantasy creatures, they always had some degree of cuteness, intended to appeal to small kids and their moms. And if you think I'm being reductive about Disney's target audience, by the way, I would cite this quote from Walt himself, attributed to a 1959 piece in The Hollywood Reporter. "Women are the best judges of anything we turn out. Their taste is very important. They are the theater-goers. They are the ones who drag the men in. If the women like it, to heck with the men." I think it's safe to assume he wasn't talking about targeting childless women as Disney's most important demographic. I think he's talking about moms here, because Disney certainly wasn't targeting single men, and somebody's got to take the kids to the theater. Another key quote from Disney, in my opinion, is this one: "We allow no geniuses around our studio." It might be apocryphal because even though it's attributed to him in a lot of places, I can't find the actual source of it, but it does seem to refer to the reality that although Disney Animation obviously employed many talented artists and animators, they were always working in service of one man's vision. There were no auteur directors on Disney films.
Not a story goes into production without his approval. For Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt is spending most of his time in spirited meetings, where every detail of the action is discussed, acted out, and analyzed. When Walt finally okays the story, it goes along to the unit animation director.
It was all about the Disney style, the Disney name, the Disney brand. So visually speaking, this required a certain uniformity. Whatever the film was, whatever the differences in subject matter, any differences in visual style still needed to remain identifiable as the Disney style. Every now and again, both in Walt's time and in modern times, they do branch out a little, but never so far out that the end product is unrecognizable as Disney. Disney cuteness, both at its best and at its worst, always signals a kind of visual gentleness that instantly draws kids in. And the younger you are, the more attractive it is, because cartoons are exaggerations of reality, but Disney cartoons are exaggerations which stimulate your senses only in the simplest ways possible. They don't require much mental engagement. It puts you in a completely passive, almost narcotized state, like the animation equivalent of jangling keys in front of a baby. Within the Disney visual formula, there are sub-formulas. They have a whole catalog of established, reliable designs for how handsome heroes should look, how beautiful princesses should look, how sinister villains should look, old men, old women, dogs, cats, kids. Essentially, there is a short list of a few stock designs for every conceivable type of character in Disney animation, which will always read, at a glance, as a Disney character. As far as the animation itself, how the characters move and react and express themselves, I think what you might call the broadness of Disney character animation must have been determined as part of the house style early on, so that whatever is happening on screen will always read as clearly as possible to the smallest of children in the audience. You rarely see the more subtle kind of animation acting that we might associate with Chuck Jones, for example. Subsequent generations of artists keep copying the company's past without thinking about why, except that that's just how it's done at Disney, and they're the best, right? So these components have been recycled now for decades and decades after Walt's been gone, only in a recursive, inbred, cargo cult fashion. All the characters and stories that get the Disney adaptation treatment, regardless of their origins, they get filtered through this same visual sameness. The consistent look of Disney is as much a part of their family-friendly brand as anything, because parents want to know what they're getting. Beyond the look of a Disney film, though, what defines the Disney brand when it comes to characters and stories? You'd think they would have an endless variety of them with all the source materials they've gathered from around the world over the years, but Disney tends to fit everything into prefabricated designs for stories as well as visuals. The original story of Beauty and the Beast, for example, doesn't really have a villain, And it certainly doesn't have a lot of cute little sidekick things or Broadway-style show tunes. So their adaptation more closely resembles their previous film, The Little Mermaid, than it does the fairy tale. These Hollywood formulas that everything gets plugged into, the heroes, the villains, the comedy relief characters, the three-act structure, it all has a way of flattening out the complexities and the unique qualities of the original works, which, to be fair, has always been a problem of Hollywood adaptations in general, but with Disney, they're simplifying for kids a lot of things that were already meant to be simple stories for kids. And the Hollywood treatment they add on top of that, celebrity voices, gratuitous songs, dialogue in modern vernacular, pop culture references, or even just the story beats that we expect when we see a movie, that takes material that was meant to be transcendent to kids, and it vulgarizes it. Because Disney claims so many powerful stories as their own, the core themes do retain some of their mystique even when they've gone through the Disneyfication process, but even adults who should know better will talk about the rich themes in Disney films as though it was the Walt Disney Company who came up with them. There's a long video of Jordan Peterson, for example, giving a lecture about the depth and complexity of Pinocchio. And Pinocchio does have a lot of depth and complexity, but he's completely conflating the original story with the Disney version, which also has a lot of prototypical Disney nonsense added to it. And while there's a lot to admire about the film as a work of animation, once again, the source material just becomes a footnote, an afterthought. Now, Pinocchio's an interesting case because it's actually one of the darkest Disney films in terms of how much strange and upsetting fairy tale content they decided to keep. It was made in 1940, and even at Disney, they assumed kids were made of tougher stuff than we give kids credit for today. I mentioned before how the oldest Disney films, to their credit, definitely have some content that's scarier than what the company allows now, and Pinocchio has some of the most infamous examples of that. In those early days, Disney definitely respected kids enough to sometimes show them more dramatically intense and frightening stuff. And it's not even the most big or obvious sequences like a kid turning into a donkey or Monstro the giant whale. There's lots of little rough edges in those old stories they were adapting at the very beginning that would all get smoothed out today. Like how in Snow White, the Wicked Queen doesn't just tell her huntsman to kill Snow White. Gruesomely, she wants him to bring Snow White's heart back to her in a box. But still, Disney being Disney, in the same film you also have the comedy stylings of Dopey the Dwarf. And in Pinocchio, their next film, which has some of Disney's scariest stuff ever, you see more additions of these cutesy details, or toning down the violence in places. For example, Jiminy Cricket is Pinocchio's cute little sidekick throughout the Disney version. In the 1883 fantasy novel on which the film is based, Pinocchio kills him with a hammer. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Snow White was also full of cute little animals everywhere, and really, for almost 100 years now, Disney has never missed the opportunity to squeeze a few cute little animals into any story. Like even their version of Pocahontas has to give her a cute little raccoon and a hummingbird. I think one of the motivations behind this is to provide a constant reassurance to children watching that no matter how scary or upsetting things get, they're still in safe hands, and everything is ultimately going to be fine, even though they rarely attempt anything anymore as upsetting as in those early films. Maybe the most infamous example is the off-screen shooting of Bambi's mom, and that's certainly a film with cute animals to spare. But even by the end of the 1940s, you could tell they were backing off, trying not to upset those moms too much. Overall, compared to some of their wilder contemporaries in the golden age of Hollywood animation, Disney's stuff is highly technically accomplished, but just very conservative and reserved in terms of content. You always get the sense you're watching something that's very conscious of not wanting to upset anyone. Consider their version of Jack and the Beanstalk in 1947, starring Mickey, Donald, and Goofy. What is the most famous line in that fairy tale? Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. The giant in Mickey and the Beanstalk makes no such threats. He's just kind of an oaf. Another example, a few years later, Disney's 1953 version of Peter Pan. The original story ends with Captain Hook getting eaten by the crocodile. That shouldn't be too upsetting to little kids, right? Captain Hook is the villain. But just to make it a little nicer, a little less violent, the Disney film ends with him and Smee merely being chased away. It's more lighthearted, more silly. And maybe in of itself, that's not such a big deal, but with every adaptation of theirs, they always make changes like those to soften things up. And when you add up all those changes in the ever-growing Disney catalog, this parallel canon of children's culture, it stands in pretty stark contrast to the source materials in terms of how sanitized it is. Not to say that Disney doesn't still sometimes take the cheap shot of traumatizing kids, usually with the deaths of characters' parents, for instant pathos, but they've figured out subtler ways to do that now that are more gentle than the sound of a gunshot going off. Consider, too, that traumatic experiences, real or simulated, can create just as much of a bond for children as any happy memories. Alternating between stimulating pleasure and inflicting trauma, that's one of the oldest, surest methods of mental manipulation and control. I want to briefly mention the prominence of songs in Disney films because music is just as much of a uniquely human and transcendent activity as storytelling. A good song can get stuck in your head like no other work of art. Music is also one of the ancient cornerstones of culture, and as such, it's always going to play a huge part in people's childhoods. No surprise, then, that the many songs of Disney films have become a part of so many people's childhood memories as well. Disney's music catalog is definitely a cornerstone of their brand, insofar as helping make Disney a multimedia empire. Because in a similar way to how their catalog of Disney-fied classics pushed out the original stories over time, the Disney music catalog has also pushed out a lot of the Great American Folk Music Songbook as a shared common musical culture, where parents might once have bought a record of kids' songs like This Old Man, or I Knew an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly, or She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, etc. They're now much more likely to put on a Disney playlist on Spotify when they want something for the kids to listen to. When you become a parent and you find yourself back in public spaces intended for children, you start noticing how pervasive Disney music is. They put it on everywhere, not just in indoor playgrounds and ice skating rinks and places like that, but even at my daughter's ballet classes, they're having the girls practice to Let It Go in a Whole New World. It's not like Disney has to sponsor any of this free advertising. It's just parentally pre-approved, and everyone assumes kids already know it and like it. A self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's not even getting into all the pop music for preteens and adolescents published by the Disney Music Group, which was founded in 1998. As far as how Disney songs function in actual Disney movies, I think it's similar to the animal sidekicks. It makes every story a little bit gentler. Take The Lion King, which has a classic Disney death of the parent traumatic loss scene. It's only a few minutes after this scene that the two wacky comedy relief sidekicks are introduced, and it's only a few minutes after that they're singing Hakuna Matata. I'm sure any Disney fan who's still watching this is probably thinking, hey, what about that song in The Hunchback of Notre Dame about hellfire? That's pretty serious. Well, for one thing, that was an aberration even at the time, and they definitely wouldn't do that today. But more to the point, they still put a song about burning in hell into an adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which gives Quasimodo goofy talking gargoyle sidekicks. Hunchback is really the peak of Disneyfication being applied where it doesn't belong, but the tonal dissonance between those two things isn't accidental, it's deliberate. Even when Disney is adapting Victor Hugo, it can never get too serious for too long. That's the Disney way. I know I don't need to go on about all of these visual and conceptual cliches, because we've all grown up on Disney, and once we start thinking about the commonalities between Disney movies, we can name a lot of them. New formulas do get introduced at Disney every few decades, but most of them were present from the start, back in Waltz day. And these patterns are so consistent, it's not even hard to imagine a Disney movie that could be completely generated by AI with just a little prompting. To briefly acknowledge the post-Pixar era of Disney that we're currently in, Pixar did introduce some new visual ideas and stories to the company, but they've since had their own problems with being artistically formulaic, not to mention morally reductive. The point is, we take these consistent features of Disney for granted, just as we take the Disneyfication of culture for granted, just as we take the predominance of Disney in children's lives for granted. The company has a uniform vision for what all culture should be, according to their brand. Once any idea, new or old, has been assimilated into the Disney corporate cosmology. A side effect, by the way, of Disney being considered the industry leader of animation since forever is there are many imitators of Disney cuteness and imitators of their simplified characters and stories, which has made it very difficult for American audiences to see animation as anything more than entertainment for small children. When we see Disney-style animation or cartoon art, we're trained to think, yes, that's what professional, legitimate American cartooning at its best looks and sounds and feels like. And that was always their goal, not just success, but primacy. The foundations of what we know as the Disney style began with Walt Disney himself, obviously. But in the same sense that Walt never intended for his versions of the classics to replace the originals, I also don't think the changes he made to them were done out of any cynical calculation to water down the source material for mass appeal. I think the changes he made, the changes that constitute the basis of what we think of as Disney movies, really did just reflect his own personal tastes. What he thought was funny, and what he thought were the best parts of the stories, and whatever he thought would make them better. He was kind of a corny guy, even by 1930s standards. And it's still his corny interpretation of culture, from European fairy tales to Americana to classic or contemporary literature, that's the foundation of the Disney style and ethos. Again, nothing wrong with that in of itself, but the Walt Disney Company is practically the Ministry of Culture for America now, and children's culture is a lot cornier for it. The cumulative effect of all of these aesthetic choices, which Disney makes in a procedural way, they basically reduce all of children's culture into mere entertainment. And what I mean by that is, when they take all this folklore and myths and legends and refine them down into something a typical family might go see at the mall, it removes almost all sense of enchantment, of suspending your disbelief and feeling like you're being taken to another world. Adapting stuff to fit within the confines of a Hollywood movie tends to turn everything into just another movie. Susceptible as kids are to the immersion of movies, even kids learn pretty quickly what to expect from most of them, and for kids that makes any story a little less special. There's a definite comfort and reassurance in that consistency for kids, but there also isn't as much magic or discovery to be had. They can categorize what they've seen as just another Disney movie, and in their imaginations, what they've seen is never going to be any bigger than that. The world of Disney is an insular, parochial one, and its familiarity provides pacification rather than inspiration. To pay respect where it's due once more, I do think the early Disney films achieve a certain level of enchantment just from the sheer level of technical accomplishment on display. Because not only were they products of a time when it was assumed that kids could handle stronger stuff, they were also products of Walt's drive to prove that big-budget, feature-length animation was a justified concept. He wanted his animators to dazzle people, and they did. From Snow White in 1937 to Sleeping Beauty in 1959, you just see an objectively higher level of artistic skill on display than what came after, which is largely routine and self-imitation. Further diminishing any sense of enchantment in these stories was that, starting with Disney's Aladdin in 1992, the studio really began allowing a greater degree of modern, ironic self-awareness in these stories. That was just the tone of the times, I guess, but For any kid who wants to experience a fantasy, hipness and enchantment don't mix. This might seem like a stretch, but there's a direct line from the more tongue-in-cheek humor of Aladdin to the outright fairy tale parody of the Shrek movies. And I suppose you can imagine how I feel about those. Not to mention all those parents who don't read fairy tales to their kids, but will put on Shrek movies for them at 3 years old. Up until Aladdin, Disney movies basically respected the integrity of the worlds they were trying to create. But there's a definite shift in tone towards postmodernism when you have the characters using more anachronistic references and fourth-wall breaking humor as that film did. It might be entertaining, but does it capture the imagination? Imagine you were a kid in 1939 who'd just seen The Thief of Baghdad, which is a very lavish and fantastical adaptation of the Arabian Nights stories. Once that movie left the local theater, if you were still fascinated by what you'd seen, you probably would have sought out the book at your library to see what else that world had to offer. Were there a lot of kids inspired to read the Arabian Nights after seeing the jokey, smarmy version of them in Aladdin? Whether the Disney version of a classic is hip or merely cute, it kind of sucks the special qualities of it right out, or redirects them to other places. I'm willing to bet that Aladdin inspired a lot more kids to get into musical theater than to open a book. And how many kids who saw Disney's Robin Hood were inspired to read that, compared to the number of kids who saw it and just became furries? To speak a bit now about the place Disney had in my own childhood, as an older millennial, I'd like to propose a generational theory. It goes like this. Just as baby boomers were the first generation to have Disney be a constant feature of childhood, literally within their own homes because of television, I think that millennials like myself were the first generation to really experience Disney in our childhoods as a mass media, vertically integrated marketing operation. One that made Disney not just a brand of children's entertainment, but basically a lifestyle brand. There was a whole other level of media saturation happening which didn't exist in my parents' time. In the 70s and 80s, when Gen Xers were kids, that was kind of the wilderness period for Disney. That was where they were floundering before they became the modern media juggernaut they are today. Initially, that started to happen because there was a renewed interest in American animation at the time, and starting with Roger Rabbit in 1988 and The Little Mermaid in 1989, suddenly people were excited about new animated Disney movies again. It was during this period that they also launched a new syndicated block of TV programming called The Disney Afternoon, reaching millions of kids after school. But I think what really started to push them over the top and let them dominate kids' lives at this time, it wasn't just the popularity of their new films, even though those were very popular. It was that simultaneously, the majority of their old movie catalog was coming out on home video for the first time. All the famous titles from their parallel canon of classics like Cinderella, Peter Pan, Robin Hood, etc., were coming out concurrently to the theatrical and home video releases of the new stuff like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. So you just had this insane level of cross-promotion happening between the company's past and present and future. There was nothing so common in every family's home at the time as those big Disney VHS clamshell cases by the VCR. Suddenly, kids could watch these movies over and over again. And it didn't stop at the home because the wider availability of Disney videos meant that they were also being played for millions of kids in daycare centers every day, or even in schools when our educators didn't feel like teaching that day. Speaking again of Disney brand kids music, when I was around 8 or 9 years old, I think my elementary school music teacher had us spend at least a year singing songs from Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. That's cultural education for you in America. Again, it's not like Disney had to sponsor any of this, it just happened because they had over 50 years worth of brand recognition to kids, and trust with parents, and this giant back catalog of product. Suddenly, it was all paying off bigger dividends than ever as every boomer parent filled their kids' lives with Disney to an unprecedented degree. Disney really didn't miss a trick during this period because while all this was happening, they started leaning into marketing the Disney brand as more than just a studio that makes quality family entertainment and runs a couple of theme parks. They were now self-consciously declaring themselves an American institution. Their catalog wasn't just a bunch of kids' movies, it was part of the country's cultural inheritance. And you had no choice but to stand in reverence to the incredible monument that was, is, and always will be Disney.
They're timeless gifts of imagination, inspired by Walt Disney's extraordinary vision. Classic stories that are part of our heritage. Stories every child should have. Family keepsakes for every generation, and a collection that continues to grow. With more great movies to add to your collection. Look for the Walt Disney Masterpiece Collection, wherever videos are sold.
The company cultivated an almost cult-like worship drilled into kids' and parents' heads whenever they watched a Disney video, because those videos always opened with a litany of ads about the latest re-releases of old titles and the latest release that you should be eagerly anticipating. Not to mention how you should be planning your vacation to Disneyland, which is presented as nothing less than a religious pilgrimage. And they openly did what Walt claimed he never wanted to do. They conflated all these old and new Disney versions with the classics they were based on in a way that disregarded the originals. This was reinforced by the fact that as all these old characters and stories were being recirculated, of course, they were also being merchandised on a level that they never had before. This is also around the time when you started seeing all these various characters with disparate origins being grouped together as part of just one big corporate ensemble, especially the growing roster of so-called Disney princesses, none of whom actually originated at Disney. The whole Disney princess marketing concept has been a huge part of virtually every little girl's life in America for over 3 decades now, and it's too big a subject to completely pick apart, but as far as robbing little girls of their imaginations, here's one microcosm of that. When I was a kid, around Halloween, you would see girls dressed up in original homemade princess costumes. Those are pretty much gone now, and we know what company to blame. There's an aspect of status seeking being taught to little girls here as well, because if the Disney Cinderella, for example, is the Cinderella which every little girl knows, and she's being glamorously displayed on clothing and other merchandise, then that's the real Cinderella as far as any little girl is concerned. And any parents, especially those who are already status conscious and have already taught their kids to feel anxiety about social status, they've already learned to associate the Disney brand with higher value. So their daughters are not going to be satisfied with some Cinderella Halloween costume that's not the Disney Cinderella, or a non-Disney Cinderella doll, or a non-Disney Cinderella film, or anything else, even though it's all based on the same public domain character. Not if they know the Disney one as the real one, which is how Disney likes it. Their parents probably think of Cinderella that way too, because when Disney puts their trademark on a character or story, it becomes a childhood luxury item. Now, in fairness to the Walt Disney Company, it's not as though they're uniquely guilty in targeting kids' minds so that their parents will buy them a lot of branded merchandise. That's just a feature of modern mass media in general, and I mean modern like going back to the 1930s, when kids would listen to The Lone Ranger or Dick Tracy on the radio and then beg mom to buy some junk they'd seen in the toy store with their heroes on it. The more mass media for kids there is, the fewer kids there are playing cowboys and Indians or soldiers or pirates. Today they're playing Paw Patrol or Spider-Man because that's what they're watching. It's their common frame of reference. When I was a young boy, I was pretty obsessed with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for a while, and that's as good an example as any of a huge multimedia merchandising campaign which captured my young imagination. My point is that in the 90s, Disney became experts at those kinds of psychological operations directed at kids. That was the point at which they embedded themselves so deeply into American culture that Every adult institution started providing Disney media and merchandise to kids voluntarily. When your kid goes to the dentist's office, there's Disney characters on the walls. When your little girl finishes her doctor's appointment, she gets a lollipop and a Disney princess sticker. Because of this, kids don't just grow up associating Disney with feelings of happiness, but also trust and authority. Aside from TV shows, home videos, and omnipresent merchandise, the primary way Disney made themselves a permanent part of the childhood status quo was the almost totalitarian way in which every new Disney movie was released. In the 90s, it was treated like a nationwide coronation event. The Lion King wasn't just a new movie, it was also a new video game, and a McDonald's Happy Meal, and a soundtrack album with a hit single. It had a mountain of ancillary licensed products like dolls and clothes and bed sheets and anything you can think of for kids. And then, after almost a whole year of hype, the whole operation just moves on to whatever the next movie is coming out. Meanwhile, you were also seeing spin-off TV shows and direct-to-video sequels for various Disney movies, old and new. Keep in mind, too, that this was back when the internet was in its infancy, so TV and movies didn't really have any competition for kids' attention. Also, consider how a child's perception of time is extremely slow. When you're a kid, days can seem like weeks and months can seem like years. 90s kids pretty much felt like Disney was part of the air they were breathing at all times because of these continual, multifaceted advertising and marketing blitzes. Past a certain point, after the 90s, the company wasn't able to just gin up that kind of excitement, to manufacture that kind of hysteria out of thin air anymore, but for a while there, Disney had the cultural capital and the reach to make the Disney brand as inseparable from every American's childhood as any studio ever had, let alone any multimedia empire like theirs. In a way, they commodified that magical feeling of childhood itself, selling their brand as a way for parents to just buy those special feelings for their kids at a store. The ubiquity of their images in a child's life was the point in of itself. Familiarity is important to kids. It's comforting. They like seeing the Disney characters everywhere because in knowing those characters and recognizing them, they feel like they know them as friends. It's because of this familiarity that, in the big picture, none of these cultural products which bear these images exist independently. A bottle of shampoo with Ariel's head on it is not merely meant to evoke memories of the film The Little Mermaid. A Mickey Mouse t-shirt does not simply represent a picture of the character Mickey Mouse. Every Disney product is essentially an advertisement for Disney itself, a trillion little idols. And every piece of Disney media and merchandise, past or present, are part of a greater whole, the Disney ecosystem, the most sophisticated and largest-scale multi-generational marketing campaign that's ever existed.
One vast and ecumenical holding company, for whom all men will work to serve a common profit.
In the world's film capital is the studio that stands as a monument to the great genius of Walt Disney, master of a new form of popular art that has captivated millions of moviegoers.
It has something that you don't have, Max. It has a philosophy, and that is what makes it dangerous.
Where are you from?
Disneyland.
Who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me? M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. Hey there, hi there, ho there, you're as welcome as can be. M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. Mickey Mouse.
The Disney World Order began with the international power of film. In the post-war period, they annexed the American home. By the 90s, their cultural domination reached unprecedented heights as they became a multimedia conglomerate. It could only have happened in that little historical epoch between the creation of home video and before the proliferation of the internet, fractured and decentralized mass media. Gaming, YouTube, anime, even just the culture of memes and message boards have all provided competition for kids' attentions, which didn't exist in the analog media days. Disney's power comes from the time when mass culture was disseminated entirely from the top down, like a dictatorship. And while they now control more territory than ever, they're not at the vanguard of anything anymore. Their power is almost entirely institutional. Disney Plus definitely holds the same place in American households that the big pile of Disney clamshell videos once did. They've had to maintain their status through the continual recycling of their old library and the continual acquisition of more and more intellectual property. In 2012, they bought Marvel. In 2019, Lucasfilm, and 21st Century Fox the same year. These recent acquisitions are a bit different from when they staked their claim on classic fairy tales and children's literature. Because, with all due respect to Star Wars, it's not like Star Wars is some sacred thing. But to give credit where it's due, I think whatever made Star Wars special to people over the years was the result of it having some creative integrity. For a long time, it reflected the vision of its creator, for better or worse. After Disney acquired it, it went through a lot of the changes we associate with Disneyfication. However, the process of something being diluted into the Disney version of itself is now a much more insidious one than it used to be. It's not just about sanitization. There's also a modern philosophical framework which every acquired property gets brought up to compliance with. Like a mandatory ethical training module from a human resources department. Even their old IPs have to be re-assimilated. The rash of live-action remakes isn't just about Disney strip-mining its own catalog, it's also about them wanting an almost 90-year-old film like Snow White to be brought up to date with the company's current values. Even the remake of a relatively newer film, like Lilo and Stitch from 2002, had to have a lot of changes made to it because, yeah, just 2 decades later, the current stewards of Disney have different ideas about what the values of the American public should be. And they take their position of authority very seriously. Before Disney bought Star Wars, you could be sure that the franchise reflected the interests and beliefs of George Lucas, but whose does it reflect now? The new Star Wars shows and films absolutely reflect some sense of morality, but it's not any one person's. It's an institutional morality, the morality of the status quo. If Disney is the unofficial Ministry of Culture for America, and America is the dominant military and economic power of the world, what does that make Disney? Would it interest you to know that at the time of this recording, the chief creative officer of the Walt Disney Company, Jared Bush, is a man whose father and grandfather worked for the CIA? What kind of values was he raised with? This man wrote many of Disney's most popular films over the past decades. Why are we entrusting people like him with the minds of millions of kids? You have to ask these questions because, really, the stories we tell kids are what teach them the values they hold as adults. And what do adults who have been raised on Disney values look like? Well, with millennials who grew up in the 90s under peak Disney, the ultimate Disneyfication victims, I think we have our answer. Disney's acquisition of Star Wars and Marvel are interesting in this light because Disney bought them hoping to widen their audience to young boys, but both of those media franchises kind of had bad reputations. The proverbial figures of the Star Wars geek or the Marvel Comics nerd have been around for a long time, but after Disney purchased Lucasfilm and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, suddenly you didn't see nearly as much mockery in the media towards young men for being fans of these things as adults. It was like the memo went out. Star Wars and Marvel were respectable now because they were under Disney's protection. People talk about the rise of geek culture in the 2000s, but I think that's kind of missing the big picture. The real story is the rise of immaturity, and the relationship that millennials have to pop culture is only a part of that. As with the decline of cultural literacy, Disney might not have been responsible for this, but they certainly benefit from it. They're not just selling their products to children or parents anymore, they have a strong financial incentive to erase the line between children's entertainment and adult entertainment. And over the past 25 years, they have successfully redefined themselves as entertainment for adults, with millennials as their most loyal customers. Disney stole your childhood, sure, but with my generation, the company's vision for children's culture became the vision for all culture. And that's when they started stealing people's adulthoods as well. I think this era began for them in 2003 with the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, because here was a movie based on one of the most famous rides at Disneyland, and it wasn't intended primarily for children. It was the first Disney film with a PG-13 rating that was released under the Disney name, rather than going through one of their subsidiaries. I remember being shocked as a high schooler that my other teenage friends wanted to go see it, because I was like, you guys want to go see a Disney movie? So the stigma of Disney movies being just for little kids was on its way out. And the biggest factor in that change was Pixar, because a year after that first Pirates film came out, you also had the release of The Incredibles, and even more than other Pixar films which preceded that one, this was the first time I remember hearing a lot of people say, "Oh, it's so good, you can enjoy it even if you're an adult. You don't even have to have kids to go see it." Well, as it turned out, a lot of millennials decided that they didn't ever need to have kids to enjoy kids' stuff. They were going to remain loyal to the first name and family entertainment, even without families of their own. The biggest reason we have Disney adults now is because millennials were the first generation to have an unbroken continuity of watching Disney stuff as kids to watching Disney stuff as young adults. Now, as a grown man who appreciates comics and animation, I'm pretty familiar with the justifications that people make when they get put on the spot about reading, or more likely watching, things intended for kids. Usually it's a kind of circular logic about how if they're an adult and they're enjoying something, then ipso facto, it's also for adults as well as children. And at this point, many of the creators of children's entertainment are well aware of these young adult and fully grown adult fans. In fact, once millennials reached Hollywood, many of them just outright began creating shows that were nominally for kids, but also intended for adolescents, and emotionally immature teenagers, and emotionally immature adults like themselves. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Disney Channel in particular has become home to a lot of what you might call YA cartoons, YA being the marketing term that the publishing industry came up with for young adults. And yeah, there's plenty of adults out there who are reading YA novels too. The feedback loop of all of this is that when young adults are consuming stuff intended primarily for kids, the stuff that should be for kids becomes more adult in nature, but not in a mature way because they're catering towards these fandoms of young adults who are themselves immature. So what you end up with is a lot of pop culture that's not sophisticated enough to be for adults only, but it's also too self-aware to be truly enchanting for kids. It's this weird middle ground that's simultaneously too naive and too cynical, too mature and not mature enough. And Disney has really mastered how to produce that kind of entertainment. More than ever, their brand has become a kind of one-size-fits-all vision for a universal common culture for all ages and all peoples of an infantilized public. The phrase Disney adult is a provocative term because that type of person has become common enough to be recognized, but Disney adult is actually a very broad category now when you consider everything they own. A lot of people are technically Disney adults by association. The Simpsons, arguably the most popular TV show of all time, the cartoon most beloved by millennials, which the oldest of us grew up with in real time, this fictional family, which so many formed a parasocial relationship with, they too are now part of Disney's all-encompassing corporate family. More than any other generation, millennials were raised by pop culture, so the values of millennials, whether they're Disney adults or not, are more or less the values of the modern Walt Disney Company, because Disney has either produced or acquired more of that pop culture than anyone. The question then is, what kind of worldview did Disney imprint on them? Did any of those Disney Channel sitcoms, which became so popular in the 2000s, did they teach them any universal truths? I know it's trite to point out that entertainment is not reality, and I'm not exactly breaking new ground in media studies by pointing out that kids are particularly vulnerable to getting a distorted worldview from Hollywood. But because the name of Disney is so sacrosanct in America, people have a blind spot about how much power they hold, while simultaneously giving them more influence over kids than any other brand of media. The Disney name is trusted to stand for entertainment that will be appropriate for kids by not having too much sex or violence. But they're also assumed to have good morals and messages, even though that's a far more complex matter. And people have assumed this for decades and decades, even though, obviously, society has changed a lot since the Walt Disney Company was founded in 1923. So in terms of what Disney really stands for and what they teach kids about the world, what has stayed the same over the past century? Well, we know the lessons you get from Disney fairy tales or ABC sitcoms aren't as harsh as what you'd find outside of the Disney worldview. Because no matter what year it is, the Disney version of reality is commonly understood to be an idealized fantasy. But ideals are what shape people's lives, especially in childhood. When you grow up and the world around you becomes less easy to understand, who hasn't sometimes wished that things could be as simple as they are in a Disney movie? Disney has provided this emotional release for a long time, like the rest of Hollywood. In the 1930s, their colorful musical cartoons were an escape from the grim realities of the Great Depression. Mickey Mouse's cheerful, can-do attitude was a huge part of his popularity. The most consistent message of Disney cartoons, and later Disney films, was that if you keep your chin up, everything will turn out all right. That's the number one thing that's never changed about Disney, the reassurance. I believe this is a big part of why their signature art style emphasized a kind of generic cuteness. And even in Walt's day, there were serious critics who took shots at him for this, the contradictory combination of lofty artistic aspirations with plain artistic tastes. And in the decades following his death, more and more people in mainstream media, especially comedians, would mock Disney and use the word Disney to mean something corny and watered down for children. As the company's size and reach expanded, you could also see them trying to redefine themselves. They knew the company's image was too squeaky clean, and their reputation was too conservative, too old-fashioned. I mentioned how, starting with films like Aladdin, Disney's humor became just a bit more ironic and self-aware because that was the tone of the times.
It's a small world after all.
No, anything but that.
They didn't want Disney to be thought of as unhip or out of touch anymore. They wanted Disney to be thought of as cool. They even had their own version of Ren and Stimpy. You don't see much mockery of Disney in the mainstream media anymore, and yeah, that's partly because they're considered hipper than they used to be, but the main reason is they just own so much of the mainstream media now.
Tim Allen gives that same likable performance we always loved, once again proving Disney pictures have the magic touch that may not win awards, but keep America smiling. How was that?
You're Satan, aren't you?
You win another round, Siskel.
The last time Disney parodies were commonplace probably was the 2000s, and on an everyday level, they occupy such a venerated place in our culture that, for most adults, not even Disney adults per se, making fun of Disney is like making fun of their religion, because the company is inseparable from their childhoods and, consequently, from their desire to give their own kids a happy childhood. There's not a lot of cultural traditions being passed on in America anymore, but Disney still provides some kind of continuity from one generation to the next. And the company very consciously positioned themselves this way. The biggest enforcers of this social consensus are Walt's old reliables, his strongest soldiers, the moms. But the difference between when Walt said that back in 1959 and what that means today is that when The Little Mermaid was released in 1989, Disney finally realized that their real customer base wasn't children in general, but little girls in particular. And with the advent of the tween marketing demographic, referring to that period between childhoods and older teenage years, which covers preteen and adolescent girls, Disney has figured out how to keep girls interested in all things Disney for as long as humanly possible. From princesses and cute animals to sitcoms and pop stars, Disney has never really been for the boys as much as the girls. Disney adulthood is primarily a female phenomenon. I think The Little Mermaid is where the modern era of Disney begins because Ariel was very much the prototypical Disney princess for millennial girls. She was modern in a way that was distinct from previous Disney girls. They hadn't even used a teen girl protagonist since 1959, and Sleeping Beauty was an old-fashioned girl even back then. The contemporary sensibility which Ariel embodied was as upfront as her bare midriff. Her story is one of self-actualization, but she has much more aggression and agency about it than Cinderella or Snow White. There's no wicked step-parents here. Her whole journey is basically about wanting to leave home because she's such a strong-willed young woman. The Little Mermaid is almost 40 years old now, and Disney girls have only gotten sassier and spunkier since then, not to mention better at hand-to-hand combat. The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast actually seem kind of old-fashioned now in that they're still traditional love stories rather than stories about a young heroine going out on some kind of quest. With the creation of the Disney Princess brand, the company started speaking to girls directly. And not long after that, once millennial girls started feeling too old for cartoons, Disney began creating a plethora of live-action entertainment, including Disney brand pop stars. Disney might not have invented the marketing demographic of tweens, but they pretty much perfected how to exploit it as far as girls were concerned. Since Disney was no longer something little girls were expected to grow out of so much, the Disney version of girlhood, and even young adulthood, was now something aspirational for girls to grow up into. And unfortunately, when you look at the kind of young girl characters on the Disney Channel whom little girls have to look up to as role models, they tend to be pretty catty. When you look at the lifestyle of a typical Disney Channel sitcom teenager that's being glamorized, it's a pretty materialistic and self-serving one, despite pretensions to vaguely defined higher ideals like family and friendship. This idealized Disney version of adolescence and teenage life, it's like crack cocaine to little girls. It's an extremely seductive fantasy because it presents a world where everything revolves around them. Conversely, is there anything Disney really has to offer young boys besides the Marvel and the Star Wars franchises they acquired? Their catalog is littered with adaptations from the canon of boyhood literature and culture. The Jungle Book, Hercules, Tarzan, Treasure Island in Space, but the rough edges of those adventures always get smoothed out just as much as they do for any fairy tale. And like all Disney films, the tone is modified to be inoffensive to moms. So even in the grandest of adventure stories, nothing's ever allowed to be too serious for too long. And that makes it harder for boys to get into because boys like it when the stakes in a story feel real and actions have consequences and the hero's journey, for lack of a better term, is taken dead seriously. I think this is one of the big reasons why anime has become so popular for young boys in America now that it's readily available as an alternative. Because while Disney films might be amusing for boys in early childhood, it doesn't take long for something like Dragon Ball Z to speak to them more. The youngest millennials are pushing 30 now, so where does the first name and family entertainment fit in for those who don't have families? For Disney adults, I think the fandom becomes their family on some level. And to throw my fellow millennials under the bus some more here, I think being raised so heavily on modern Disney values might have something to do with our reputation for being too soft, too emotionally immature, and after the financial crash of 2008, for our thwarted sense of entitlement. Maybe Disney adulthood is partly a kind of mass trauma response. Some people think there's inherently fascist undercurrents to indulging in childhood nostalgia, the theory being that if you tell people their happy childhoods are proof that something has been stolen from them, you can make them demand political action to return to it. Disney, as usual, is conveniently left out of these arguments, but if you're talking about weaponized nostalgia, what other company has engaged in such industrial-scale production of childhood memories? Long before millennials, nostalgia was always part of the Disney brand. Walt's childhood determined what a lot of the stories were that he adapted. Literally, the first thing you do at Disneyland is walk through an idealized recreation of where he grew up at the turn of the century. The 2013 video game BioShock Infinite is partially a satire of this Main Street USA fantasy, and the fact it's revealed to be a dystopia might be where some people got the idea that all nostalgia has a fascist subtext. But the Disney conception of childhood, and now even adolescence, is so idealized it can't help but inspire fanatical devotion, especially from only children and children of divorce, two categories that are certainly well represented among millennials. I say this with sympathy. There's a lot of adults out there right now who are either confused or embittered that real life is not like the Disney movies or TV shows they grew up with, even if they know, objectively, that that's a foolish thing to yearn for. Because Disney made it so easy to remain in that Disneyland fantasy long after childhood. And just as that's not going to end with the millennials, the effects of society-wide arrested development are going to continue to be felt by everyone. An infantilized public is a more helpless and easily manipulated public. Nostalgia might not be inherently fascist, but to deny any political implications of a Disney-dominated culture is just naive, especially when the company is so self-conscious and frankly self-important about their role in shaping millions of people's lives. Walt himself was no stranger to propaganda. Consider that in World War II, the American State Department actually commissioned him to go on goodwill tours of Central and South America. They also co-funded 2 Disney films with the goal of strengthening ties with Latin America. A decade later, Walt was promoting the U.S. space program on the wonderful world of Disney. He was very much happy that his company, his name, and he himself could be so synonymous with America. He certainly believed in the post-war dream that America could unify the entire world as the guiding light of democracy and free enterprise. He expressed his faith in this dream in his own cornball Disney ways through projects like the It's a Small World ride, which debuted at the 1964 World's Fair, and in his plans for Epcot Center, which included a kind of permanent World's Fair pavilion of different countries. Walt had utopian ideals about America's place in the world, like most Americans at the time. But unlike most Americans, he actually was in a position to shape that vision in the popular consciousness. He would have loved the 90s because history repeated itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Part of the reason his company thrived more than ever in that decade was that America's position as the center of global affairs seemed more indomitable than ever. The dream of a small world after all seemed to be coming true, including the notion that any ethnic conflicts could be pacified under the dominion of American culture, which Disney was synonymous with. I'm barely exaggerating because this was a time when political pundits were making insane statements like, "No 2 countries that both have a McDonald's have ever fought a war against each other." In the wake of the Cold War ending, another concept which really caught on in the 90s was that of multiculturalism, and Disney began pursuing its own version of that. It's not a big leap from It's a Small World After All to the idea of being a world citizen. Disney prides themselves on being able to adapt any culture into their brand, at least for an American audience. But the American audience is also the template for the global audience. Disney believes that just as America is an idea which everyone can become a part of, all peoples can be represented by Disney. It's through Disney that the corporate ideal of global culture finds its ultimate expression. Of course, this is not without its contradictions. At the same time that Disney was making Mulan, their version of a Chinese folk legend, their films and TV shows were temporarily being banned in China in retaliation for distributing the film Kundun, which was Martin Scorsese's biopic of the Dalai Lama. The president of Disney had to apologize to the Chinese Communist Party just to open up the Chinese market again. Disney has to operate according to a kind of idealistic cynicism, or cynical idealism, where they want to make entertainment that will unite the entire world, but without ever offending anyone. When you think about this balancing act, the overlap between the U.S. State Department and the Walt Disney Company starts to feel a lot more natural. In the first half of Disney's existence, it's easy to look at their catalog and see what got cut out or toned down from the classic stories or fairy tales they adapted. In the second half of their history, which we're still living in, their relationship to culture is far more complex because it's literally a matter of international policy. Their productions are no longer so Eurocentric, as academics like to say, but they're also no longer so concerned with the American mythology that meant so much to Walt. Disney is now in the strange position of still being a symbol of America, if not the symbol of America, but also representing post-American, post-national values. They're not just teaching kids a particular worldview for their day-to-day life, but also how to view the rest of the world and their place in it. In the past, working for Disney would have already carried a huge sense of social responsibility because you knew you were making stuff that was going to be seen by millions of kids across America. It's a little hard to imagine the sense of scale that people at Disney must feel bearing down on them now, knowing they're expected to make entertainment that will be seen by virtually every kid on the planet. Besides all the morals and messages that Disney globalism imparts to kids, what effects does it have on their imaginations when it comes to foreign cultures? I think when a child's first impressions of a foreign culture come to them through a Disney filter, the kids get robbed of any natural wonder they might have developed about them. Because Disneyfication is a universal solvent that reassures kids all cultures are basically the same if they can be made to fit within the confines of a Disney movie. The excitement of being exposed to stories, art, music, and so on from other countries comes from how different they are to your own. But the multicultural ideology which Disney ascribes to insists that ethnic differences are basically superficial, because they can still be plugged into all the Disney movie formulas we're familiar with. Nothing can ever be too otherworldly to fit into the wonderful world of Disney. It's a kind of Pax Americana where every ethnicity on Earth gets to be enfranchised by having their own Disney version. I titled this video How Disney Stole Your Childhood, but that's putting it mildly because when someone steals your childhood, they really steal your whole understanding of the world and even of yourself. Disney went from a studio that made animated shorts and films to making live-action films and television to a theme park empire to the largest multimedia conglomerate in the world. This empire was founded on the treasures of the past, and now it stays alive through cultural imperialism. We've all grown up with Disney to some degree, but so many have spent their whole lives in the shadow of the empire. The psychic mindscape of their childhoods was colonized, occupied, and conquered as part of the greater Magic Kingdom. If imagination is at the center of our cultural landscape, that land has lost its sovereignty. Mermaids, genies, pirates, princesses, and even all the different cultures of the world are commonly introduced to kids in a proprietary way through Disney. And how many fantastical concepts or ancient motifs like transformation, ancestral memory, or even true love are filtered through Disney when they first reach a child. The essential truth about storytelling is it's never just mere entertainment. You're always having a view of the world imparted on you, whether it's deep and meaningful or shallow and stupid, which makes storytelling for children nothing less than sacred. Kids are ravenous for stories because they're ravenous to learn about the world. If the most important storyteller in their life is an entertainment conglomerate, and every classic story they know is a part of that same corporate franchise, that company becomes like a nanny who the kid starts to trust more than their actual parents. The problem with Disney storytelling is that after they've plundered the riches of the world's imaginarium, all the myths, fables, legends, and literature, they homogenize them. When Walt was around, he at least paid due respect to the source material, but that was a long time ago. We're in a post-literate society now, one where Americans have lost touch with their history and reject the idea of high culture entirely. People still want a shared culture, but they have a hard time imagining raising their kids without outsourcing all that storytelling to this international government-backed institution. We presume this corporate empire has moral, political, and philosophical neutrality, but what have all these Disney versions really been teaching us? At least with Walt, you could boil that down to what one man believed in. Does the Walt Disney Company merely maintain society's status quo, or have they come to consider themselves the ongoing arbiters of how children should be raised? Disney-branded childhoods become Disney-branded adulthoods, become Disney-branded reality. The inspiration for this video was my realization that the ubiquitousness of Disney actually posed a threat not just to the connections I was making with my own kids, but also their ability to dream their own dreams. I mentioned how one of my daughter's favorite stories is Rapunzel, and Rapunzel was the story that made me see this. Because when I started experiencing the joy of reading to her, it occurred to me that if her first exposure to that classic fairy tale was the Disney version, that was going to be the main version in her mind forever. Rapunzel would be just another member of the Disney princess clique that she'd see on backpacks at Walmart and on t-shirts at the playground and wherever else. When she wanted to play it at home, she'd want to play a version of Rapunzel with snarky humor and animal sidekicks and all kinds of other Hollywood nonsense. Not to mention a Rapunzel who gets reunited with her parents at the end, as if that's the point of the story. I'm glad that in her mind, in her imagination, Rapunzel's voice is her voice, not some voice actress. Bill Watterson, the author of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, once wrote something about this regarding his refusal to license his characters for animation or even merchandise. He said, "The world of a comic strip ought to be a special place with its own logic and life. I don't want some animation studio giving Hobbes an actor's voice. The world of a comic strip is much more fragile than most people realize or will admit. When a cartoonist licenses his characters, his voice is co-opted by the business concerns of toy makers, television producers, and advertisers. This could be said about the integrity of any artistic work, but particularly of works for children, where the author carries a greater responsibility to protect the integrity of the enchantment they're trying to create. A lot of authors' voices have been co-opted by culture merchants like the Walt Disney Company, mostly long after they were dead, so it's not as though they had a say in it. Regardless of the accomplishments Disney's had in the past, why do people still look to them as a font of creativity? Largely it's because that's what they've always told us they are. The 20th century, the century of Disney's ascendancy, was also the century when advertising, public relations, and propaganda as we know them were created. Walt might not have allowed any geniuses at his studio, but he never showed any modesty when it came to being called one, whether by the press or in his own publicity materials. The history of American animation was practically written by Disney's marketing department.
What do you read?
It's a biography on Walt Disney. It's fascinating. He's a genius, you know. I I mean a once in every 50 or 100 years kind of genius.
What are you, 12?
And decade after decade, they continue to self-mythologize and self-aggrandize. Walt is depicted as nothing less than the greatest storyteller in the history of Western civilization. Their new stuff might not be as popular now that they have to compete for kids' attentions with the internet and video games, anime, etc., but their vast library of content, which they built on the backs of the classics, has unquestionably enshrined them as a permanent institution of American life. They made the Disney brand synonymous with the idea of childhood itself, and there can be no greater triumph of corporate will. There is a mouse inside your head. You must exterminate it. I don't mean you should try to deny the existence of Disney, because how could you? And yeah, a lot of their old films are good, sometimes even great movies for kids. If you appreciate animation, it's some of the most technically accomplished stuff you'll ever see. And really, it's fine for kids to enjoy the Disney versions of things sometimes. My favorite Disney film as a kid was The Jungle Book, which is a pretty far cry from the original story. But the point is, it's not like the Disney Jungle Book has kept kids reading the Kipling book. You need a literate society with a baseline cultural canon for that, and we don't have those anymore. We've lost the context. If you introduced kids to the original works first, wherever possible, they'll at least understand that the Disney version of any classic story is just that. It's only a movie. Those characters and stories don't really belong to Disney. They belong to them, your kids. You'll be stopping that mouse from burrowing into their heads permanently at a young age. When I was a very young kid, I went through an intense phase of being obsessed with Peter Pan. And the first version of the character and the story I ever saw was a 1960 TV broadcast of the 1954 Broadway musical. That musical version sticks pretty close to the original story and stage play by James Barry. My parents brought home the big clamshell VHS tape of it, and it's probably my first memory of watching anything because I vividly remember feeling like our TV was literally a magic window into another world. Because I loved it so much, at some point not long afterwards, my parents also brought home the clamshell VHS of the Disney film, which had just been released on home video for the first time. And I liked it, sure, but even as a 4-year-old, I just knew that the Disney version didn't have as much going on. Both versions told the same basic story, and the Disney version had a few songs of its own too, but even though I couldn't have articulated it at the time, I could tell that it was a simpler, less sophisticated, less dramatic, and overall more syrupy sweet version of what I'd seen already. If the Disney version had been the first one I'd seen, I don't think Peter Pan would have been a significant part of my childhood imagination. It would have just been another Disney film. Peter Pan has been in the public domain for a long time, so according to the law, he belongs to everyone, and it's Disney's right as much as anyone's to create their own version of him. But when we passively allow Disney's version to be the primary version, we collude in their cultural monopoly. To paraphrase The Last Psychiatrist, Disney didn't just teach us what to want, but how to want. We surrendered our childhood imaginations to them, and millions of people are trying to buy back those special feelings as adults, and/or to buy them for their own kids, continuing the cycle. But kids deserve a real masterpiece collection, not just the Disney versions. They deserve real magic in their young lives, not just the corporate brand of Disney magic. Storytelling is magic, and every story counts, especially during childhood. So, what vision of the world will you give your kids? Disney World, or the world of pure imagination?
Can you remember the way it used to feel when you believed in make-believe and fairy tales were real? It's like a dream come true, but still inside of you. Come be
be a part of Disney World's 25th anniversary.
It's time to remember the magic.